watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church of Marble Falls, Texas. For almost 130 years, FBCMF has served Marble Falls and the greater Highland Lakes area faithfully through children's programs, youth activities, and adult discipleship. We invite you to join us each and every Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30 a.m. for deep fellowship, rich worship, and a spirit-filled message. For those who find themselves unable to attend on a Sunday morning, we stream those services. Simply visit fbcmf.live during either of our service times to view it. Never miss an archived sermon by subscribing to this podcast on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/FBCMFtube. And to learn more about our church or to listen to an audio-only version of this and other sermons, please visit us online at fbcmf.org.
What we're doing, for anybody who doesn't know, is we're looking at various board games that seem to mimic something that we do in life, a life practice that we have, or a life practice maybe that we shouldn't have. And so far we have looked at the game of operation, that God is doing an operation on our heart and on our mind. And last week we looked at the game of trouble, that there are three kinds of trouble that people get into. There's dumb trouble, and then there is natural trouble, and then there's godly trouble. And today we are looking at the game Monopoly and considering what the Bible has to say about that. Monopoly goes way, way back. You can trace it all the way back to the early 20th century. And the game was produced by Parker Brothers in the late 1930s, right after the Great Depression. Monopoly is the most successful board game of all time. It has made more money. It has done better than any other board game. And it was invented by a man named Charles Darrow. And contrary to belief, that's not Darrow. Here is Darrow. Here's the real picture. This is Charles Darrow. And what he said is that he was struggling to make a living. And so one day he just said, I wish that I owned all of these places in he lived up in New York, and he said in Atlantic City there are all of these places that he wishes that he owned. So he got a big sheet from his house, a big piece of cloth, and then he laid out all of these areas and properties in Atlantic City that he says he wishes that he owned. And then he kind of made a board game out of it so that you can go around and get all of those properties in Atlantic City. And later on, Parker Brothers bought the game from him, and Charles Moreau died in the 1960s, a very, very wealthy man. The funny thing is that there are a lot of people who claim that Charles Moreau stole the game Monopoly from them, that he went over to a group of people's houses and they were playing it, and then he stole the idea from him. And so ever since Monopoly was founded, people have been arguing over who has the rights to it. And even today, there's a huge court battle as to see who's going to get the future monetary rewards and who really owns the game of Monopoly. And I think that that's ironic and kind of fitting that a game that is all about acquiring money is being fought over as to see who gets the most money from it. But what does our Lord Jesus have to say in regard to this theme, this idea of trying to accumulate and get as much as you possibly can? Do any of you know people in life who actually live a real life kind of monopoly? This idea that's just a fun board game actually is the way that a whole lot of people really live. And I don't know what playing Monopoly was like for you guys when y'all were growing up, but for me, when I was a little boy and I would play with all of my cousins, we would be there and we would play hours and hours. Monopoly is not something that ends in an hour. Man, it goes and goes. If you start playing at 6 o'clock, by the morning you might be finished with it, especially if you have family members who cheat a little bit at it. We would play for hours, and man, you need this money and you're excited to get to go to collect $200, and you finally get there, and then you land on somebody's property and that person takes everything you got again, especially toward the end when somebody has like hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place, and you land, not just houses, hotels on these things, and you're just praying as you come into the home stretch that you don't land on those things, and you land on it. And everybody around just kind of makes fun of you. You landed on it, and then somebody else lands on it. And slowly throughout the game, you started out as friends. We were excited to play at the beginning of the game, but 13 hours later, and everybody hates each other. That's the way it was in our family. And whoever won, it's like, congratulations, you won, but nobody likes you now. And that's kind of the way it is in real life too. These people who play this real life kind of Monopoly, I don't know that they get it, that when money and possessions and accumulation is the most important thing in their life, that they are disenfranchising every relationship they have. That it's hard for other people when all the thing that you care about the most is money. Because if you live your real life like a Monopoly game, it ruins relationships. Greed does that to people. Greed is this thing inside of us that begins to care more about our own way of life than everybody else's way of life. And it sounds very similar to the broken relationship that we see in Luke chapter 12. Listen for the brokenness. A man goes to Jesus and he says to him, "Make my brother divide the inheritance with me." Y'all hear the broken relationship? It didn't have to be that way. But now these two brothers are opposed to one another and fighting each other over this money. Have y'all ever heard of people getting into issues because of inheritance type stuff? Where money begins to divide siblings who once played together. They were excited at the beginning of the game, but at the end of the game, they don't even like each other anymore. There's a relational divide caused by money in Luke chapter 12, and Jesus attributes it to this ugly, ugly sin called greed. It is very ugly. And what greed does is it begins to settle into our life in such a way that materialism begins to separate us from people. There's an author named Randy Alcorn, and he said this, that materialism will inevitably produce the kind of society increasingly evident in America. A society, and this is what it's produced, he says. So if materialism is rampant in America, if people are playing this kind of real life Monopoly game all around us, then this is the society that it's produced. And tell me, y'all think about whether or not this sounds kind of right, that a society of individualism where people live parallel lives, not meaningful intersecting with others. So you live a life in parallel, but sometimes with the people around, there isn't a meaningful kind of interaction. A society where independence is the only absolute, where self-interest is the only creed. And this is what greed does. It makes you very independent and separates. Where convenience and expediency and profitability are the only values. A society where people know the price of everything but the value of nothing. Where people have a great deal to live on but very little to live for. I've experienced that and seen that. I can kind of picture poor greedy Ebenezer Scrooge that sits in his room counting all of his bank account, but he's completely alone He's isolated himself from everybody as he moves in that direction. And also he counts all of that while there are other people who go hungry and go thirsty and have need. If you haven't figured this out, greed and loneliness go hand in hand. They go together. And Jesus is so sensitive to this. Anything that begins to take something that is not God and begin to elevate it to a God-like status, Jesus is very sensitive to that. His radar is able to pick up on that very quickly. So this guy comes to him and says, make my brother divide this money. And Jesus' radar begins to see it. This person is elevating money that's not God to this God-like kind of status. And he's giving ultimate weight and worth on it as if that's going to fix everything in his life perhaps. And Jesus sees all of that. And so to help all of the people around him understand the issue that's happening with this man and his brother, Jesus then turns to all of the other people around and he said, let me tell you all a story. Once upon a time, there was a farmer and he had a huge crop. He had enough not only to give himself food, but give a ton of other people food as well. But what he did was he said, man, because of this crop, I'm going to tear down my old silos and I'm going to build these huge silos to fit this massive, massive crop. And y'all know what? That kind of person who is that successful, we would call him a huge success in America. In our own community, if somebody did that well, what we would have the tendency to do is to see that person then becomes very popular. Groups would want that person to come and speak. If you're the chairman of any board of directors, you would want that person to come and sit on the board and be with you, to invest and to share and to talk and to speak in whatever things that you're a part of. That person would achieve some kind of celebrity status and might even win small town kinds of elections. That person would become exceedingly popular. And then Jesus looks at this person that our culture would call popular, and he says, you're a fool. Y'all, isn't it amazing that the same kind of person that our society would say, that is the epitome of success. Let's elevate that person. That Jesus looks at him and says the exact opposite of what our culture would say about that person. And because Jesus calls him a fool, when the rest of us might have the tendency to call him wonderful, and that demonstrates how far it is from the culture of God to our culture. It demonstrates the kingdom of God and how separated and different the kingdom is from oftentimes our kingdom and what we create. God is different. We have this tendency to want to elevate and accumulate and never think that we have quite enough. And here's an example of this. In 1958, an economist published a book about the affluence of America, and he called it The Affluent Society. And he writes in it, did you know that in 1958, what he said about Americans were that Americans were extremely affluent and that Americans loved their affluence in 1958. But y'all know this, when you look at 1958, at the way that people really lived, 9.5% of American households had air conditioning. And he said, Americans are so affluent, and they love their affluence. Only 9.5% even had air conditioning. Only 4% had a dishwasher, and only 15% had more than one car. But he said there's this affluence that's inside of them that they love having. Well, you fast forward to this moment in 1958 when the book came out, and at the end of the 1970s, our country had been through a very difficult recession, and so the presidential campaign in 1980 had this as the basis for it. There was a question where the two candidates would ask all of the citizens, are you better off today than where you were? And all of the people said, no. 22 years later, after 1958, when only 9.5% of the people had a dishwasher, or only 9.5% of people had air conditioning, only 15% had more than one car. 22 years later, the presidential candidates, are y'all better today than you were 22 years ago? And everybody said, we're not. But here's the statistic. 22 years later, the amount of Americans who owned dishwashers in their homes had increased by 700%. People had not just one car, but people had 2 cars. Most of American households, it went from 15% who just had one, all the way up where most Americans had more than one car by 1980. And yet, are y'all better off or worse off? We're worse. We're worse off today than we were in 1958. What's wrong with us? Where we can accumulate more and more and more, and then we still say we're worse off than the way that we were? Y'all, is there a chance? Do you imagine that you can accumulate so much that it doesn't really take away greed, it contributes to greed a little bit? That accumulation sometimes can make people more greedy, not less greedy. Affluency. There's a man who said, you know what? Prosperity is very good campaigning weather for the devil. Men can take almost anything rather than prosperity. There's something that it does to us. There's something that affluence kind of does. And here's a case in point. You remember just a few years ago, you remember the name Ethan Couch? He's that kid who drove drunk and he killed 4 people when he was driving. And then what the people did is they said, well, it's because of his material wealth. He's just so affluent. Because when they would talk to him, and they asked him things like, were you sorry you did all this? He was just kind of numb to all the pain that he had caused anybody. And he kind of seemed to think that what he did was, okay, and as if they shouldn't have been there in the first place kind of thing. And they were trying to figure out, psychologists and others were trying to figure out, how in the world does somebody destroy other people's lives and be so callous to what he's done? And these people looked at him and said, we think the problem is that he's so affluent and he comes from such affluency that he has developed a disregard for other people. And they called it something. They said, this is a new thing. And they said, he has a disease called affluenza. Not influenza, affluenza. It was all over the news. They called him the affluenza teen who had been so spoiled, had been given so much, was so affluent that he just thought everything in life revolved around him. And y'all know what? Affluenza is exceedingly contagious. It gets in your family. It gets in your home. You can pass it on to your children very, very easily. You can pass it on to your friends that you golf with or to the women that you hang out with. And it can even get into your Bible study groups. Affluenza can affect you even if you don't have that kind of disease. But if you hang around with another person who is, slowly but surely, it's contagious. Affluenza can get us all. And the most pathetic thing about that kind of disease, the most pathetic thing is that the fool in the story in Luke chapter 12, he became so affluent and he developed this affluenza. He had all of these crops, all of these resources, but God forbid he looks at other people who are starving, other people who need everything, and he holds it. And the most pathetic thing is he lost it all in the end. Other people got his wealth, and that's why he is such a fool. All of us get separated from the things that we possess, that we once held as almost godlike in our life. We get separated from all those on the day of death. Jesus asked the question, what are you going to do when other people get all of the stuff that you once held so dear? Death makes everybody generous, doesn't it? Death makes even the greediest, miserly person you've ever heard, even that person becomes exceedingly generous on the day that he dies. Somebody says to me then, but Ross, when I'm dead, I won't care who gets all of it. I can live this way, and when I die, it doesn't matter anymore. I beg to differ. I submit to you that you're going to care more in the life to come about how you lived right now than what you think. I think that you're going to care exceedingly more at that time about whether or not you were greedy or generous when you get to heaven than you think that you might. There is a congruence. There is a connection between the life that we live right now and heaven. It's not a salvation by works. It's certainly by grace. But at the same time, heaven is not so disconnected from the things that we do and the things that we say as if they're just two totally separate situations. No. There is going to be a moment, there are times in heaven when we realize that we really could have done better, and it's going to affect you and it's going to affect me. There is a congruence in that sense between heaven and hell and heaven and earth. When we get separated from the things that we loved so much, the Lord has a way of in heaven of helping us to see what we could have been. Someone told me a story about a man who had a dream, and he dies and he goes to heaven, and he goes to hell as well, and he sees all of it. And I've shared this with you before. But he goes to hell first. And when he gets into hell, all of the people in hell could not move their elbows. Their elbows were locked out. But they had all of this food in their hands. And the problem is that because their elbows were locked out, they weren't going to feed themselves. They couldn't feed themselves because they couldn't have the elbows to do that. And so in hell, all of this abundance was there, only their elbows were locked out, and they couldn't receive any of their the food that they had. But for the other people who were around, they easily could have given it to them. But in hell, everyone was so greedy that they refused to share anything that they had. And so the dream takes him up to heaven, and when he is in heaven, he sees that the situation is exactly the same. All of the people in heaven also didn't have use of their elbows, and they also had a lot of food. But in heaven, they had figured out a plan that if they just offered and shared with what they had with one another, then everybody would have sufficiency. Everybody would have abundance, and they could share and help one another. And this man, as he was thinking about it, he couldn't help but realize that the great divide, the great distance between heaven and hell was generosity. The willingness to give was the difference between those two things. And I think that's Jesus' exact point in Luke chapter 12. That you can taste heaven if you can begin to be generous. You can bring heaven here if you can begin to be generous. And so he says, be aware of this disease that's so contagious called affluenza, this greediness. God knows that the only cure for it is generosity. And so that's why in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves cannot break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Store up treasures in heaven, in rich generosity. Y'all know, there's so many ways that you can be generous. I hope that y'all don't get mad when preachers talk about tithing as a part of generosity. Our church never has been frustrated about those types of things, and we're doing so well. You're doing so well in all of that. But I just want to remind you, and I don't say it very often, that tithing is primarily so that you don't have this disease of influenza that other people in your culture can impact you with. That when you give and you're generous, what happens is it keeps away the materialism and the greed and the influence of your life. But it also, y'all, helps our church so very much. The children's ministry, the youth ministry, the missions that we do together. When we take up an offering of tithes to give to the Lord, it makes a difference in all of that. And it helps our church to impact the world around us and to impact our community as well. And we hope that every member of our church is very consistent in tithes and offerings. If you're not, and you're a member of our church, talk to your spouse about that. Talk to them about it so that you can do well unto the Lord with all of this. So you can end up being a little bit more like Jesus Christ, who never plays Monopoly the way that we think about it. If Monopoly is trying to get as much as you possibly can, God did the opposite, didn't he? God gave as much as he possibly could. When we look at the cross, when we take the Lord's Supper, as we're going to take right now in just a second, we are jolted out of our greediness and our greedy tendencies that want to accumulate. When you taste the bread and the cup and you look at the cross of Jesus Christ, we're jolted out of our greediness. And it makes such a difference in our life because we're reminded that we serve a generous, generous God. And we're created in his image. And we worship him. He makes us everything. And so what a moment it is. I hope that as you take the Lord's Supper, you will remember these things and that generosity is what you will pray for.
You've been watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church of Marble Falls, Texas. Never miss an archived sermon or video posted to our YouTube channel by subscribing to it at youtube.com/FBCMFtube. For more information about our church and to hear an audio-only version of this sermon, please visit us online at fbcmf.org.